Before we start, I want to divert your attention to my new podcast. It's called Slappendipity. It's me and my friend Eric, who are two creative people, with me being an established YouTuber who's been doing this for 6 years, and him being an aspiring voice actor. On the podcast, we tell stories from our personal and professional lives, and we set the podcast in a fictional place called Happy Slappy Town. We build up the lore for Happy Slappy Town as we go. There's a lot of what Eric calls little magic in our lives, and it manifests in this podcast as crazy coincidences and the serendipity in Happy Slappy Town, thus Slappendipity. The first few episodes are up now. Even if you take a listen and it's not for you, just stop by and say hi to Eric in the comments. And now on with the video. Mrs. Afton, a character who doesn't have a first name. A character who arguably doesn't have a last name. A character who might not even exist. My name is GiBi, and welcome to the Horror Homestead. One of the things I like to think and yap about is the FNAF community, and the difference between the things that we know, fanon, or things that the community overwhelmingly accepts, things we argue about, and then wild speculation. Things we know would be things like Mike is William's son. Things we accept would be that Mike Afton is Mike Schmidt. Things we argue about might be whether or not Mike is a corpse zombie by the time of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, or if he's been healed by Remnant. And wild speculation is something like, what color is Bonnie? Nah, just kidding, it would be something like, is Candy Cadet possessed? Like, we got no idea. I love addressing basically all levels of speculation. Like, I love doing fact videos about stuff we know. I love attacking things that the community is sure on, like if FNAF 1 takes place in 1992 or 1993. And then the other two are where most theories come in. Mrs. Afton falls in the wild speculation category, because realistically, we know nothing about her. We don't even know if she exists. Or do we? Well, first we have to talk about conceptual representations. This is a depiction of a bird. This is also a depiction of a bird. But this version has less detail. It's almost like you zoomed out and you squished the pixels into a recognizable shape. This is a zoomed out depiction of a bird. There's less detail, it's less real. A photograph of a house is a more zoomed out depiction than a video. This is further zoomed out than a photograph. We can see that it has house-like things. It's enough house-like that we can tell it's a house. But where is the dining room? Where's the roof? They're not there because this is serving its function as a depiction, a representation of a quote-unquote real house that exists within the story of FNAF. So, like, we understand that there is more to the house. Mike has a bedroom. There's a dining room somewhere. William has a bedroom. There must be a kitchen. But we don't need them for the story that's being told, but we do know that they're there. If we look at the map from Sister Location, it shows that the FNAF 4 house is basically bigger than the entire street that it's on. Obviously, this isn't real, but in this zoomed out depiction of a neighborhood, it's fine that the only house that matters is so big that it's basically the whole neighborhood. We understand that there are other houses, but in the story, this might as well be the only house in the neighborhood because it's the only one that matters. Likewise, we know that the Afton children have more than one parent. It would be biologically impossible for them not to. But we don't know if the reason that there's only one shown in the games is because by the time the story starts, there is only one parent, or if he's the only one shown because he's the only one important to the story. This video will investigate that question. Because FNAF is a video game, we kind of have an issue. Going back to the FNAF 4 house, how do we know whether it's literal or not that the house is right next to Fredbear's? Is it actually next door? Or does this just mean that there is nothing of importance between the house and Fredbear's? Something not important enough to be depicted to get the layout of the town. Or it could mean that they are literally next door. There could be streets, there could be trees, there could be a park between the house and the Fredbear's. But if they're not important enough to tell the story, they may not be represented by anything more than just a single screen in the entire minigame. When I say depiction, I don't literally mean pictures, although that is what depiction means. Just roll with it. The Afton family is depicted as William the father, Mike the oldest son, Cece the younger son, and Elizabeth the daughter. We see these characters and we know their relationships to one another. I can put pictures of them on screen because they have files in the video game associated with them. But these images are very zoomed out depictions. This picture of Mike doesn't express to us that he likes chewing gum, or that he has a British accent. This picture of William shows him as purple, but of course he's not literally purple. We don't even know his hair color. We don't know from this image that he's a murderer, or an inventor. So these zoomed out depictions of people combined to form a zoomed out depiction of a family. And zooming out that many layers is like, it's like a lot of zooms. But there is no Mrs. Afton. Mrs. Afton is the dining room of the FNAF 4 house. We know she's there, but like, she's not there. Okay, so, how do we know that she's there? Why are we assuming that William had a wife? Well, if we assume that human reproduction in FNAF works the way it does in reality, then there has to be a biologically female human who has gone through puberty before the conception of Michael Afton. We are going to call this person Mrs. Afton. She doesn't have to be married to William, but that's going to be the name that we use. We know that the Afton kids were not adopted because Mike looks like William.
Father, it's me, Michael. They didn't recognize me at first, but then they thought I was you.
So they are biological children, or at least Mike is. We know Elizabeth is his daughter because she calls him Dad.
Daddy, just once let me go play with her.
And we know that Cece is his son for a few reasons. In Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, a poster shows representations of William, Mike being his puppet, Baby as a clown, and Cece as a birthday bear with a big ol' mouth. These are the Aftons. Note, there is no Mrs. Afton. In the security logbook, Mike, the person writing it, is clearly Mike from Sister Location, aka Michael Afton. However, this Mike also references the events of FNAF 4 with one of the best lines in the series. He tripped and fell on Freddy's teeth. Not our fault. And he also draws Nightmare, meaning that he was the one dreaming FNAF 4. Mike is Foxy Bro, and thus Cece is William Afton's son. Okay, so now all we need to do is contend with the question of if any of the three Afton kids are robots. Let's do that now. Mike is not a robot because he was scooped in FNAF 5 and then his skin rots. Elizabeth is not a robot because she dies. Baby is her as a robot, therefore her as a kid, not a robot. Cece... Okay, let's talk about Cece. Robot kids. Robot kids exist in FNAF. Charlie in the Silver Eyes novels is a robot kid. And that's it. Okay, there were other robot people. In one of the FNAF anthology stories, a man believes that he has a wife and kids, but they're actually robots and they only look real because of illusion discs. But the only robot who thinks they're a real person in the franchise is Charlie. Charlie was killed as a kid. Her father, Henry, built progressively older-looking robots for her spirit to inhabit. Her soul, via some tears or something, latched onto a stuffed animal, and the stuffed animal was able to be moved from robot body to grow up. She could bleed, and cry, and sleep, and thought she was human. What does this have to do with Cece? When Cece was dying in FNAF 4, a voice, assumed to be William's, tells him,
"You are broken. I will put you back together."
This could mean two literal things. One, Cece is a robot who is broken, so he will be put back together. That is one layer of literalness. Layer 2 is that Cece is a human, but now that he's dying, William is going to make him a robot. He's going to put him back together with robot bits. He's going to be a cyborg. That's less literal, but it's still taking all the words at face value. And then there's the metaphorical option. William sees people as things, as machines. So Cece isn't dying, he's just broken. He's broken like a machine that William can fix. He's gonna make him all good as new again. If it's this third one, then Cece was not a robot prior to his death, and thus needed a mother. But then why would William say,
back together?
why back together? What does that mean? The phrase put back together is used elsewhere in the series. In Sister Location, Mike states that William sent him to put Elizabeth back together, and he succeeded.
And I found her. I put her back together, just like you asked me to.
There's two ways of interpreting this. One, putting someone back together means that a spirit haunting an animatronic regains their identity and has control over their animatronic. Baby went from wanting to kill who she thought was William to wanting to help William and calling him Daddy, because now she is Elizabeth. And two, putting someone back together means something like combining all of their remnant in some way, like if their remnant is split between multiple animatronics, now they're all together again. It's possible that Mike put Baby back together when he allowed her to combine to form Ennard. That Ennard is Elizabeth back together.
They were all there. I put her back together. She's free now.
This implies that Ennard might be Elizabeth back together. Of those two conclusions, I strongly hold that it's the first one, that Mike removed this green thing from Baby, and that this is when Elizabeth took over. It's not factual, but it makes more sense because Baby then splits from Ennard again. So obviously, Ennard can't have been her put back together. With that said, when Baby does split from Ennard, she says, I'll put myself back together. Which could mean that Mike did put her back together when she entered Ennard, but now that she left, she has to put herself back together again? Although with that said, there are multiple perspectives here. Maybe to Baby, she had to physically find parts and put herself back together, becoming Scrap Baby. As an animatronic, she thinks of herself as her body, and thus putting herself back together is finding a new arm, whereas the human characters think of themselves as their spirit, their souls. And so being together is your entire spirit being one. I don't know. But the point is, there is an interpretation of being put back together where it makes perfect sense that Cece was a human who was dying, who William wanted to put back together by allowing his spirit to stay in control of some sort of animatronic body. That means this line does make sense even if Cece is not a robot. William wanted to put him back together, but this doesn't happen because Happiest Day happens instead, and so really the only control that Cece ever has is possibly over aspects of Golden Freddy. Possibly. So no, Cece is not a robot, probably. He is probably Golden Freddy, and never gained control over his animatronic before being set free. So none of the Afton kids in-game were Charlie-style robots, at least up until the end of UCN. After that, I have no idea. Maybe Mike is Glamrock Freddy and Cece is Gregory. The jury is still out on that era of the timeline. The point of this video is that William needed a female to have children with, and that Mike, Elizabeth, and Cece are his biological children. Therefore, Mrs. Afton must exist. Okay, so Mrs. Afton exists, but we know nothing about her from the story. Now, you might be screaming at me right now, saying, GiBi, there are 5 references to Mrs. Afton in the games, what are you talking about? And so that's kind of what the rest of this video is about. What role does Mrs. Afton play in the games? My answer is none. Absolutely none. The community has different ideas, like MatPat made her the mastermind of the Pizzaplex era of the timeline, and FNAF has mentioned in some of his experimental theories that maybe she was the reason that William was driven to murder. But I think that the answer is that if she's not depicted anywhere, then she's not important. Her not being in the story is because she's not important to the story. Okay, but she is in the story, you say. Okay. Let's look at the 5 appearances of Mrs. Afton in the series, and I will reconsider my stance. Number 1. Mrs. Afton is Clara. I have a whole video about how Clara from The Immortal and the Restless is not Mrs. Afton. It was originally part of this script, but it got too long. Link is in the description. Number 2. Ballora is Mrs. Afton. Ballora is an animatronic first introduced in FNAF's Sister Location. People think she's a representation of Mrs. Afton for 2 reasons. 1, her actual design as an adult human woman, and 2, the lore of her in-universe character, which could potentially match a Mrs. Afton character, including her dialogue and her famous song. This first part, her design, well, it's true and obvious, and basically my only counterpoint is that linking Mrs. Afton and Ballora together because they're both adult women is a very loose connection. Baby and Elizabeth both have red hair. Baby is... well, she's named Baby, and Elizabeth is William's baby. Elizabeth literally says,
"Didn't you make her just for me?"
I think the game goes to great lengths to point out that Baby is a representation of Elizabeth, up until the point where it confirms that she's being possessed by Elizabeth. My argument is that the same is not true of Mrs. Afton and Ballora. Ballora shares no design similarities with Mrs. Afton, because there is no design of Mrs. Afton. While Baby's name is a reference to her design and her relationship with William, Ballora's is not. Her name is Ballora. She's a ballerina. Some people have gone as far as to say that Mrs. Afton may have been a ballerina or a performer of some sort. But when claims like that are made, we need to extend that line of thinking to the other characters. Elizabeth is not a clown. Cece is not a bear. So even if Ballora is Mrs. Afton, there's no reason to think that the real Mrs. Afton was a dancer. I personally think the most compelling piece of evidence that Ballora is not a Mrs. Afton stand-in is that Ballora is not, within the narrative of Circus Baby's Pizza World, Baby's mother. You have an adult woman and a character who is a baby, and they're not mother and daughter. Ballora kind of has a mother-like relationship with the Mini-Renas, but Baby has a similar relationship with the Biddy Babs. These are clearly two different families, so to speak. If you think about the Funtime animatronics as a whole, you have a ballerina, a clown, a singer, and a puppet show. I don't know where Funtime Chica falls into that, but you know. Typically it's understood that Foxy is a symbolic representation of Mike for obvious reasons, or that Mike is symbolized by being a puppet. Not a puppet the way that the marionette is a puppet, but more like a dummy.
Dummy.
But there's no connection between Mike and singing, or Mike and Bon Bon. Bon Bon even has a female version that appears, and that connection, if anything, is more akin to Charlie and Sammy. Seeing Ballora as a woman and going, "Oh, it's Mrs. Afton," is to me a bigger stretch than looking at Bon Bon and Bonette, who are male and female twins and also hand puppets, and connecting them to Charlie and Sammy. I think when we look at things that might represent other things, we have to be very careful to not find patterns that don't exist. I think if someone tried to argue, Bonette is a puppet, Bonette has a twin who's a boy, Charlie had a twin who's a boy, therefore Bonette and Bon Bon are Charlie and Sammy, I don't think many people would believe them. And I believe that that's stronger evidence than Mrs. Afton being Ballora because they're both adult women. Same thing with looking too closely or literally into real-world history or themes that are brought up in the game. Historically wise, the design of Ballora separates her even more from Mrs. Afton. Looking at Ballora's design, we see a few notable things. She has rosy cheeks. She has eyelashes and the suggestion of some sort of tiara. She has a necklace and earrings. She has breasts, and if you look at the blueprints, they are not necessary to house any sort of internal wiring or anything. They are purely cosmetic. She's wearing fishnet stockings, and naturally has a ballerina pointed toes, as well as an overall hourglass figure. In glitchy screens from the game, you can also see that she does have eyes. However, those eyes are underneath her closed faceplate. So it's not that she doesn't have eyes, it's that her eyes are always closed. The eyelashes, breasts, and hourglass figure are arguably present in order to gender her as a woman. Specifically, the elongated eyelashes and hourglass figure are common caricatures of a female figure. The tiara necklace, earrings, and fishnet stockings are also feminine, but in this case have more to do with her being a performer. The tiara and necklace are reminiscent of pearls worn primarily in the 1930s, although pearls were in fashion up through the late 20th century as well. Like, I don't think that Lisa Simpson is a throwback to the post-Depression era of fashion. However, the 30s era was also when circuses were most popular, as well as when people began looking toward Hollywood for culture. Watching a professional ballet performance may have been high class, but musical films and circuses were for everyone. And so even though ballerinas have existed for centuries, I can see the association with that time period. Ballora is calling back to the 30s. I know that there are people who try to argue that the Afton, specifically Mrs. Afton and William, were around in the 30s, but I think that that argument needs a lot more evidence, and that, if anything, this is pointing out that those aren't necessarily linked. The iconography of Freddy Fazbear's might depict times of early 20th century American culture, but that does not mean that William grew up in the 1930s. The most interesting aspect of her design to me are her rosy cheeks, and they're why I don't think that we should look too literally into any of this. Rosy cheeks are a side effect of the way that alcohol alters blood flow within the body and causes inflammation. The reason that clowns have rosy cheeks is because the town drunk likely had rosy cheeks, and thus the clown, playing the part of the fool, will have rosy cheeks. So Ballora has rosy cheeks because of alcohol. I can see some FNAF theorists trying to argue that this is a hint that Mrs. Afton was an alcoholic or something, when it's obviously just a reference to the lineage of the history of clowns. I don't think that Elizabeth, who also has rosy cheeks, is an alcoholic. So because I don't think that we should take the rosy cheeks literally, I also don't think that we should take the pearl necklace, ballerina, etc. that literally. I don't think this means that Mrs. Afton was around in the 30s. In my way too long FNAF video, I took the fact that Ballora is Mrs. Afton at face value, and I worked her design into my narrative by stating that her design has her eyes closed, because William thought that her eyes were closed to his brilliance, and that she never understood his work or how smart he was. And while I stand by that that's a pretty darn cool interpretation, I think there's another reason her eyes are closed. Looking at her blueprints, you can see that her function as a tool for William's remnant collection hobby was as a distraction. She's supposed to deter and to misdirect in coordination with Baby's Directive Number 7, which is likely when Baby snatches a kid. So Ballora takes parents' eyes off their kids while Baby snatches one. So I think her eyes are closed to symbolize the parents' eyes being closed to what Baby is doing. So none of these elements of her design are something that ties her to Mrs. Afton. If anything, her eyes being closed to what Baby does is in reference to either William or Henry. William is distracted and thus doesn't notice Baby snatch his own daughter. So in that case, Ballora is William. Or else it's Henry who is distracted and doesn't notice William snatching kids in general, and keeps his eyes shut and his ears plugged to William killing kids until years later. If you subscribe to the theory that Henry was arrested after the MCI instead of William, the way that you should subscribe to this channel, her being a distraction is an even bigger tie thematically to Henry. Heck, if Ballora is Henry, it makes sense as to why the Ballora family, of Ballora and the Mini-Renas, is a separate yet similar family to Baby and the Biddy Babs. Henry is even arguably the face of the company, as in FNAF 2 when things start to go down, Phone Guy tries to contact the owner of Fredbear's Family Diner, which most people agree is Henry. William making an animatronic that distracts people from his own evil doings, symbolized by literally having its eyes closed to what he is doing, just fits Henry so much better than the non-existent Mrs. Afton. But now we're going to move on to point number 2, which is Ballora's character, her song, and her voice lines. In Sister Location, while sneaking through Ballora Gallery, we hear her sing this song.
Why do you hide inside your walls when there's music in my house? All I see is an empty room, no joy, an empty tune. It's so good to sing all day, to dance, to spin, to fly away.
Now let's break down these lyrics. First, we have to ask the question, was this song made by Ballora's AI or by William programming it in? That is very unclear. One thing I will say is that I believe for certain that Ballora is not possessed by Mrs. Afton. Whether or not she's supposed to represent her is still up in the air. But I think it is very unlikely that she is possessed by Mrs. Afton. That was a popular theory at the time because we didn't know how Remnant worked yet. We just assumed that one murder equaled one animatronic. And thus, if Baby was William's daughter, maybe Ballora was his wife. But now that we know that you can split Remnant, and that Remnant doesn't really mean soul as much as it means life force, and that you can use one murdered kid to bring Ballora and all the mini-arenas to life because the S in Scoop stands for scalable, we know that this doesn't have to be the case. Molten MCI theory, that gets a lot of its evidence from the fourth closet, basically tells us that the original MCI kid's remnant was taken from the original animatronics and put into the Fun Times, as well as Baby, the Biddy Babs, and the mini-arenas. We can be pretty sure that Ballora is brought to life by the remnant from the MCI kids. There was no reason at the time to think that this was even possible, so that's why the headcanon that she is Mrs. Afton persists. But with hindsight, she is almost certainly the MCI kids. Okay, but from William's perspective, is she supposed to be his wife? Did he program in this song?
Why hide beside your walls when there's music in my house? All I see is an empty room, no joy, an empty tomb.
Are these words that William would put into the mouth of his wife? Okay, so we're going to look at this backwards to show why people think this is Mrs. Afton. No more joy, an empty tomb. If we beg the question and ask why Ballora is Mrs. Afton, we can see that there used to be joy, but there is now an empty tomb. In a marriage, you can imagine that at one time there was joy, but that over time the couple drifted apart. The tomb, which is where you put dead people, is likely a reference to the fact that this is at the point in the story when the Aftons have lost either one or two children, depending on your interpretation of the timeline. So the loss of their child or children has brought the joy out of their marriage. Now we go back to the line, all I see is an empty room. This could either refer to the empty bedroom left behind by Cece and or Elizabeth, or to their marital bedroom that William is no longer in since he's in his workshop now 24/7. Go back to the first couplet, why do you hide inside your walls when there's music in my halls? Basically, why is William always in his workshop when she is trying so hard to reach out to him? It also brings up the metaphor that he's putting up walls or emotional barriers between them, likely as a result of the depression from losing their children. The last couplet is slightly more confusing. She says, it's so good to sing all day, to dance, to spin, to fly away. If we're taking this as a linear story, then Mrs. Afton saying that she's tried to stay positive and keep their marriage together, that William is retreating both physically and emotionally, but she's just gonna keep trying to stay positive. Some people might also read into this as her taking some sort of medication that makes her manic or happy. And that reading does exist. The song ends with, to dance, to spin, to fly away. Fly away has multiple meanings, either medicating with happy pills to fly away, like to get high. Fly away as in to divorce and leave William, or fly away as to mean to commit suicide. Anyway, the interpretation is that William changed as a result of the kids dying. So he retreated from their marriage and Mrs. Afton left, either mentally checking out, divorcing him, or dying. That's the strongest argument in favor of the community's typical interpretation of this song. Except I don't agree, at least not anymore. I'm going to break this down as a song/poem first, and then apply it to FNAF, instead of trying to find meaning assuming that it's Mrs. Afton. Also, that's what begging the question means. A lot of YouTubers erroneously say begs the question when they mean raises the question. Begs the question actually means when you begin your argument or evidence by assuming a conclusion. If you assume that Ballora is Mrs. Afton, therefore the tomb is a reference to Mrs. Afton's dead child. That's begging the question because you're assuming the conclusion before you look at your evidence. A real argument would look the other way around. Alright, so we're going to start from the top here and see what this poem actually says. Why do you hide inside your walls? This is a question that the author / poet / singer / speaker, however you want to say it, but I'm going to say author, is asking a specific person. You in the poem refers to a specific person who is also a character in this story. You are hiding inside your walls. The character of the author doesn't enter until the next line, so for right now we're only going to focus on this you character. They are hiding in their walls, which as I stated earlier could mean literal walls, like shut into an office, or metaphorical walls, like emotional barriers. Typically, in the sense of the emotional walls metaphor, the person with walls first builds them. You put up a wall between yourself and the outside world or another person. But the song doesn't state that they're putting up a wall, but that they have walls. This could imply that they've always been shut out from the world. If we relate this to FNAF, we can argue that William was always some sort of psychopath, or was damaged as a child somehow. Other characters in the story, like Henry, don't develop walls until later in their lives. In the Silver Eyes trilogy, his walls wouldn't go up until after Charlie's death. So in this poem, it's either stating that the you is somebody with a social disorder, or that the walls are literal. Again, like an office or a workshop. When there is music in my halls. This line introduces the singer or author, I'm going to keep saying that they're the author, into the narrative. The author possesses halls. Now, there is no metaphorical archetype of having halls the way that there is for having walls. But if we take that widely understood metaphor and we expand it, you can imagine that while walls close you off, halls might connect you to other people. A hall has many doors, and so if you have a hall, then you have many connections. However, hall could also mean something more literal, like a dance hall or a music hall, especially since we know that the speaker of the poem is a ballerina. I actually think that's a much more likely intention of this imagery. There is music in my halls. A music hall. A music/dance hall are of course where many people congregate for a party, or where there is a performance. Having music is usually a stand-in for some sort of positive emotion, like somebody whistling because they're so happy. But in the context of this song, the tune is very sad. So could the music reference here be sad? It's not asking, why are you closed off from me when I'm over here so happy? It could be, why are you closed off from me when I'm over here so sad? I'm in the hall ready to make a connection. I'm in the hall looking for you to comfort me. But you're hiding in your office. Moving on to the next line. All I see is an empty room. This could have three meanings. The you in the story isn't in their room, like the author is peeking into their room. The you in the story isn't in some sort of shared room, like the author is sitting in their shared room looking around and it's empty beside themselves. Or there is another empty room that does not belong to you or to the speaker. This final interpretation being what most people think this is a reference to. The empty room being Cece's or Elizabeth's bedroom. But so far, I think sticking with the idea that this is about two people, the author or speaker, and the you character, makes the most sense. We have someone in their walls, we have the speaker in their halls, and the speaker sees an empty room. I think the meaning is more like, I see all around me is an empty room, like they are alone in the room. Now this kind of conflicts with the idea of the you character being inside walls, because that would imply that they're in their room, but they're not. So how can you be in your walls but not be in your room? Again, it makes me think of them being in an office or a workshop. This takes away the idea of this being metaphorical about emotional walls, and the metaphor completely breaks down once the empty room becomes a literal empty room. Because you can't be behind your walls, and then in your walls they're empty, so you're not in your wall. It doesn't make any sense. If we want to maintain the metaphor, which is what I think is intended, then I really think we have to look at it as a dance hall being empty. You are in your walls. I am in my dance hall. but it's empty. No one is dancing. With this interpretation, again, my thoughts go to Henry. The dance hall is Freddy's, with literal music, but William is away in his walls. Those walls could be his workshop, but we also should keep in mind that William was trapped behind a wall for decades. Not exactly hiding, but he did hide inside that very safe room while committing his murders. William, why are you hiding in the safe room when there's music in the main party room? Because of your actions, all I see now is that Freddy's is closed, in an empty room. No more joy, an empty tomb. The presumption that this is about marriage explains why there was joy, but now there's not. It was happy when they first got married, but have since drifted apart. But joy is also something that kids have at a birthday party, at an arcade, at Freddy's. No more joy could mean that Freddy's is closed. Arguably, it could also mean that Circus Babies is closed. In this interpretation, then William's halls is literally his secret office where he's hiding, and the music in the halls is Ballora's gallery, which closes and then there's no more kids around. So William could be in his workshop or in the safe room, the halls could be Freddy halls or Ballora's halls. The second half of this line I think is going to be the most contentious part of the video. An empty tomb does not call to mind something like the empty room Cece would have left behind after his death, or the marital bedroom William would have left Mrs. Afton in after he buried himself in his work. An empty tomb only brings to mind one thing: Jesus. A tomb is obviously where you put bodies after death. If we replace tomb with, like, casket, and you say that there's no more joy in empty casket, that either means that nobody died, the casket's empty, someone did die but there's no body to bury so the casket's empty, or somebody died and then came back to life, the casket's empty. And somebody coming back to life out of a tomb, well, that's Jesus. Jesus was sentenced to death for essentially blasphemy, and he was tortured, crucified, and died, and then his body was placed in a tomb, and the tomb was covered by a large rock. A few days later, his friends and family come to check on the tomb, but they find that the rock has been pushed aside and that the tomb is empty. Jesus has returned from the dead. In my way too long FNAF video, there were comments pushing back about the biblical references in the narrative, and I just have to say that it's incredibly stupid, because the Bible is the most culturally important document in the Western world, and literally everything is a biblical reference. It's either the Bible, Shakespeare, or some other mythology. MatPat also got pushback when he talked about the biblical references in The Amazing Digital Circus, and it's just so insane to me. Like, I can't even imagine the ignorance required to ask why someone's talking about the Bible when they're breaking down the themes in a piece of fiction. I have to go on this rant because I know otherwise I'd get comments about why I'm bringing religion into FNAF, but this is clearly in the text, especially when you take into account that Scott created religious works before FNAF. The phrase "an empty tomb" is an overt reference to the Easter story, and there is no way that Scott didn't know that. So if we take this as a reference to the Easter story, how does that fit into our understanding of the first 3 lines? Well, if an empty tomb refers to resurrection, and yet the preceding line said that there's no more joy, we could see this as in fact being a inversion of a biblical story. A common way of people invoking the Bible is to mirror biblical stories but have them be sacrilegious or inverted. Right, like Frankenstein, it's a story about someone who rises from the dead, but it's in the opposite way as Jesus. Witches practice magic, but it's from a deal with Satan as opposed to Jesus' miracles. Anakin Skywalker is the inverse of a Christ figure, whose body is resurrected with technology, similar to Frankenstein's monster. Evil figures in fiction, like Lord Voldemort, are obsessed with gaining immortality and eternal life by doing evil things on Earth to keep their physical body around, while the good guys in these archetypal stories gain their eternal life by doing good things and going to heaven. The community thinks of William Afton as a Dr. Frankenstein mad scientist figure already, so this idea of him achieving immortal life by playing God was already present in his character, especially in the context of the Silver Eyes trilogy and sister location onward. So an empty tomb refers to the resurrection of Christ, but in the context of William in his walls, in his workshop, the way he's bringing someone back to life is bad or wrong. There is nothing good or natural about bringing his child back to life by having her possess a killer robot. There is no more joy at Freddy's. The kids are all gone. However, this has directly led to the resurrection of someone who died. There was music in the hall, but it is now empty. William is trapped behind a wall, either his office or the safe room, but it led to a resurrection. Is that the MCI kids' resurrection? Elizabeth? William? It could also be Freddy's being resurrected as circus babies. It could be all of them. The next couplet is the most confusing, though. It's so good to sing all day. Good has two main meanings in modern parlance. It could mean something is done well, or it could mean that something is morally correct. It's so good to sing could either mean it does one well to sing, or else it is morally the correct thing to do to sing. The thing I think is important here is how, for this final couplet, the speaker doesn't mention the you from the song, nor the me in the song. This seems to be a declaration to the listener. It's so good to sing all day. Not it's good for me to sing all day, or good for the character you to sing all day. It's a statement. It is good. Since we determined that music is the music that is heard in the party room at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza or Circus Baby's Pizza World, singing is also arguably this same type of music. So if Freddy's has been resurrected as Circus Babies, it's so good to sing all day. Aren't you glad this entertainment restaurant franchise is back after being resurrected? Outside of that context, it could also be the author having looked around the empty dance hall and deciding to start singing anyway. Even though William is in his wall, the correct thing to do is for the person in the dance hall to keep singing. To play to an empty restaurant because it's in her nature. Then to go on to dance, to spin, to fly away. Fly could mean a few things. The one I think of first is Ballora and the other ones escaping as entered at the end of the story. Right, this is about Freddy's being resurrected as circus babies, and it being empty, and so therefore the best thing to do is to fly away, as she does when Michael is scooped at the end of the game. However, there are other connections. In the beginning of the game, William says,
"She can dance. She can sing."
So who else sings all day, dances, spins, and flies away? Well, possibly Baby. If you're going on my assumption, my hypothesis, my bias that this is all about Henry, that Henry is the speaker in the song, then it being good to sing, spin, dance, and fly away is likely a window into his motivation for his actions after the MCI. Singing all day is good, so he should do it. He should make more music even though Freddy's is closed. He should still work on his animatronics. In the narrative, we know nothing about what Henry does between founding Fredbear's and then his return in the next game after sister location, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. But in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, he does return with a new restaurant. So at this point, when we're listening to Ballora sing this, Henry might be planning to return. Why is Ballora saying this? Because Scott wants to give us, the player, insight into Henry's actions. This lyric could refer to Henry flying away by committing suicide at the end of the next game. No matter how you view the song, Ballora's song either being an interpretation of Henry as Scott understood him at the time, or as William understood him at the time, is, in my opinion, a valid and more compelling argument to her importance than her being Mrs. Afton. If you ignore the fact that she's an adult woman, the same way we ignore the fact that the marionette is a male puppet, and if we look at her role in the story, we see someone who William has blinded, who he uses as a distraction, who sees William hiding himself away, who laments the end of something, but notes its resurrection into something else. And I think that leaves Henry as Ballora. One of my rules of theorizing is that the importance of lore should be proportional to the evidence that contains it. So the secret mound of dirt in the secret second half of Midnight Motorist, one of the 3 mini-games in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, is not the smoking gun that Cece is a robot. It's likely an indication as to the time frame of William Afton building his first or second house. The mound of dirt is them breaking ground on something house-shaped. It's a small detail that tells you a small detail, not a small detail that tells you the entire story of the series. Likewise, Ballora is not symbolic of the entire character of Mrs. Afton, who doesn't exist anywhere else in the franchise. She's a storytelling device. She's not a character. She's a method of telling the story, like Candy Cadet, and she's telling a story about William, the main antagonist, and Henry, who by this point existed in the Silver Eyes novel and around this time was being written in the Twisted Ones novel. It's talking about how Babies is a resurrected Freddy's, which we already know from Hand Unit, and how the series has a theme of resurrection in an ungodly way, which we already knew, and how Sister Location specifically homages Frankenstein more than previous entries by being more like science fiction. And it also fits the theme of Ballora being a ballerina and wishing she could leave, which she does by the end of the game. In other words, the song is not about how Mrs. Afton divorced William or committed suicide. It's about things that we already know. Sister Location is not the end of Ballora's appearances, as she also has lines in Ultimate Custom Night. Before we get into those, we need to take for granted that the player of UCM is William in the afterlife, and thus the person that she's speaking to is William. I've discussed the evidence for this in other videos. We also have to keep in mind that the voice lines in UCN have references and Easter eggs for the audience's benefit. Like Toy Chica saying, "You won't get tired of my voice, will you?" So when Ballora says to William,
"Why do you hide inside these walls?"
that's not necessarily confirming that the "you" in her song from Sister Location is William, any more than Toy Chica's line is confirming that the player of the Halloween update of FNAF World is William. When Ballora says,
"Admit it, you wanted to let me in,"
it's obviously a callback to the song, but this line is in the context of her killing the player, i.e. her being let into the room before a game over. I think this is more of a callback for the player than it is as a lore hint. Number 3. Mrs. Afton is Couch Person from Midnight Motorist. I'm not egotistical enough to say that I solved Midnight Motorist. In fact, I have a video called Unsolving Midnight Motorist. But some people think that the gray couch guy is Mrs. Afton. If Cheeto Man is William and the runaway is Mike, then this is likely Mrs. Afton. My interpretation of Midnight Motorist is that the runaway is an MCI victim, specifically this MCI victim.
I told him to come over later. That should be enough. And if he doesn't show up, I'll just go to his house. And if he doesn't open the door, I'll just find a window.
And the footprints are from William luring him outside. Cheeto Man is the MCI kid's abusive father that drove him to want to run away to Freddy's. And Grey Couch Guy is the MCI kid's mom or grandfather or something. Just a parental figure who turns a blind eye to the abuse. I go into more detail in my way too long video, and again in my Unsolving Midnight Motorist video. But needless to say, I do not think that this is Mrs. Afton at all. Number 4. Mrs. Afton is referenced in Vanessa's tapes. I'm no expert in Security Breach, and honestly I'm trying to stay away from the Pizzaplex era of the timeline until it's concluded. Hopefully we get a Fall Fest game, or something to conclude the story of Gregory and Cassie that can wrap up whatever's supposed to be going on. But in the tapes in Security Breach, you can hear meetings between Vanessa and her therapist or counselor or whatever. These are already under layers of obfuscation because it's unclear, firstly, what Vanessa is, and secondly, when she is herself and when she is Vanny. If she is Vanny. For background, a computer program got infected either by William Afton's spirit or by a robot that is mimicking William. It brainwashed a woman into doing William's bidding. This woman's name might be Vanessa. She certainly goes by Vanessa after the brainwashing. It's also possible that Vanessa is a robot. She's either a robot that is supposed to be a grown-up Elizabeth Afton, although I find this hard to believe because she's blonde, or she is a person who was brainwashed into becoming Elizabeth Afton. Vanessa, being the name of William's daughter in the movie, helps this comparison. In the game, Vanessa, after being brainwashed, sees a therapist, and we can hear a clip of their conversation. The therapist says,
"I've read through all your files, so I feel like we've been talking for weeks. I feel like I know your dad, too. Bill, right? Your dad's name was Bill?"
Bill is of course a nickname for William. Now we know that Vanessa, or someone, has the ability to change files within Fazbear Entertainment. So this file the therapist read might be real, or might be a plant. Basically, we don't know if this is Vanessa's actual file from her life, or if some influence of William changed it to give Vanessa Elizabeth's backstory. So the real Vanessa's real father might be named Bill, or that might be an invention of William.
Your supervisor notes that you follow instructions perfectly. Your dad made you follow instructions, didn't he?
Since this session is happening post-brainwashing, it's telling the audience that Vanessa has to listen to William's instructions. By saying that she listens to authority well, and needed to listen to her dad well, it helps us make the connection that it is William controlling her. However, here's the interesting part. Your dad made you follow instructions. Elizabeth didn't follow instructions. That's why she went to see Baby and died. If there's one thing we know about Elizabeth, it's that she disobeyed her father. So did William plant within Vanessa the personality of Elizabeth? Or the idealized personality of Elizabeth? Or is the real Vanessa a good follower of orders? And is that what made William want her as his puppet?
I'm talking about the custody battle between your mum and your dad. Your dad didn't play fair, did he? He used to make your mum look bad in court. I suppose I don't need you to tell me it felt bad to have a parent scare you into saying things that weren't true. He manipulated you. It wasn't your fault. It's really sad. But it's common for one parent to use their child to hurt the other parent.
This definitely points to a divorce between the father and the mother. And if the father is Bill, is William Afton, if William changed files to make Vanessa's past the same as Elizabeth's past, then this really seems like the Aftons got divorced. But is that logical? Why would William Afton gain control of a human in order to have her try to resurrect him, and then put in her personnel file that her father was manipulative and a bad person? That's him! Why would he paint himself this way? If it's assumed that this isn't William's spirit, but is the mimic or something, then I guess the mimic is trying to create some sort of perfect representation of the Aftons, warts and all. But if that's the case, he wouldn't have made the Elizabeth stand-in follow orders, because she didn't. The lone other interpretation is something I find more compelling. Vanessa, the early 20s security guard, had divorced parents. Her father was controlling, and her father made her testify in court against her mother. And
I know your mum after she lost the custody case.
And Vanessa's mom kills herself. This made Vanessa a vulnerable individual who was scarred at a young age, and made her more open to being brainwashed.
I was supposed to be a good girl.
From a storytelling perspective, I think these tapes giving us background on Elizabeth Afton, when Baby has been absent for multiple games, is kind of silly, and that this is more likely backstory for one of our new protagonists, Vanessa. I think it's more compelling to learn the backstory of Vanessa, who was the player character in Help Wanted, and one of the 2 human characters in Security Breach, and is likely important going forward. This is her Foxy Bro killing Cece moment. This is her childhood trauma that led to her being in this predicament. A scared, scarred kid who is easy to be influenced by William.
What happened to her had nothing to do with you, even though it was your testimony that did it. Was that testimony true? No, I didn't think so. But your dad is to blame, not you.
Vanessa having a resentment of her father, and William Afton then taking on that father role, might actually be what allowed her to break free of his spell and defeat him. She hates her father. William made the mistake of becoming her father, so of course she turned on him. There's less hard evidence here, and again, I hope that something comes out in a future game to explain all of this. But from a narrative standpoint, not a theorist standpoint, it just makes so much more sense that this is Vanessa's backstory, not Elizabeth Afton's. Theorists try to put all the pieces together to understand things, there's a drive to want to understand Mrs. Afton and discover the backstory to the series. So when we get this puzzle piece, we slot it in where we want to hear it. We want this to be something about a character that we all already love. But this isn't about the past. This that we're playing now, Security Breach, is a story with new characters. And it is my bias as a writer, but it just makes more sense to me that this piece of information is about Vanessa. Maybe her dad's name was Bill, and that's one of the things that made Glitchtrap / the Mimic pick her. Or maybe that was William's influence on hacking the file or whatever. But either way, while I understand the interpretation that this is about Mrs. Afton and Elizabeth, and I see how that conclusion was reached, I don't agree with it. Number 5. The Nanny Staffbot is Mrs. Afton. Hello and welcome to the only representation of Mrs. Afton that I think exists in the entire franchise. This is the Staffbot family. Staffbots in Security Breach are the main NPCs, basically filling every function in the game that one of the major antagonist animatronic bosses don't fill. They're the guards, they're the enemies, they're the NPCs, etc. Attendant Bot exists in Bonnie Bowl to serve ice cream. Their design and function is obviously a reference to Circus Baby. Keep in mind that this era of FNAF has the company using their intellectual property and history to serve the Pizzaplex in a variety of ways. The original Circus Baby dispensed ice cream. The company may not know that that was actually a trap to lure kids, and then it got Elizabeth Afton killed. All they know is that she served ice cream. So in the Pizzaplex, the bots that serve ice cream look like Baby. Magician Bot appears in the Fazbear Theater and is a magician. In the sewers of the Pizzaplex, you come across a table with a few Staffbots sitting at it. This location is the only place where we see Server Bot and Nanny Bot. There are 5 Staffbots sitting around the table. Everyone believes that these are the Aftons. Circus Baby Bot is Elizabeth. The one with no head is Cece. The one dressed up like a worker is Mike. The magician is William. And the old woman is Mrs. Afton. There she is, she finally exists. One of the things that I like doing when theorizing FNAF is playing the games myself, but I don't have a Security Breach save where I can jump in and walk around this room to look for more context, so for right now I'm going to have to leave it at these very low resolution pictures we have. One thing to note is that the Staffbots within the game are controlled by the entity that is Burntrap or Glitchtrap or the Mimic or whoever it is. Except there's also some of them that seem to actually be controlled by the Puppet or by Nightmarion. Again, the Pizzaplex era of FNAF is just all a mystery. So it's unclear who wanted these Staffbots here, if it's the Mimic trying to mimic the Afton family, if it's a Glitchtrap trying to get back his family that he had. Was this Vanessa? We have no idea. Okay, so big question number 1. Why is William a magician? Well, this is when we have to turn to the cutting room floor and the next major level of obfuscation. Security Breach has a lot of cut content, and the problem with cut content is that we don't know why it was cut or whether it's canon. If this was re-added in an update, which they absolutely could have done, then yes, it's canon, that's great. But it wasn't, so you have to ask, was this cut maybe because Scott didn't want it there? The magician appears on stage earlier in the game, and there was supposed to be a magic show. In the magic show, he tries to pull a rabbit out of a hat. This is obviously relating him to William.
For my first trick, I will pull a rabbit out of my hat. Error, no rabbit found.
He hypnotizes the crowd to sleep, a reference to William brainwashing Vanessa.
Now, for some hypnotism, I will now pick an audience member at random.
He then makes the crowd disappear, the way that William made a bunch of kids go missing.
For my next trick, I will make the audience disappear.
That's why the magician is William. You also have to ask why the worker person is Mike, other than that he's the only one left. Mike doesn't wear a propeller hat, he doesn't wear a vertically striped shirt. He wears a foxy mask. Even this character being Mrs. Afton because she's a woman, that's the same logic I didn't want to use when discussing Ballora. So solid evidence-wise, we really only have Baby, and then we have the person missing a head as Cece, and even the one character missing their head, there are other characters who miss their heads. At the end of Security Breach, Glamrock Freddy loses his head. In most people's interpretation of the game, Freddy is some sort of Mike stand-in, and Gregory is Cece, and Vanessa is Elizabeth. But that means that Mike lost his head if Mike is Glamrock Freddy, and that doesn't track. Mike is known for Foxy Mask and being scooped, so why isn't the Mike bot here scooped? Why isn't his chest cavity torn open? Why isn't there a fox drawn on his face? There's a present on the table, so maybe it's someone's birthday, but why is there no cake? Why is there no knife in William's hand to cut the cake to indicate that he's the stabby man? Why isn't Cece wearing a striped shirt? Why does Mrs. Afton exist? Inside the gift box is a flyer for Fredbear's Family Diner. Their phone number is 1-800, which is a typical phone number for a business in case you aren't American. That is very generic. And then 083. 1983, the year of the chomp. Since we looked at cut content earlier, I want to look at the last piece of evidence in this video. A conversation you're supposed to hear upon approaching the table, but that was cut before the final release. Honestly, in my opinion, I find it hard to believe that this was cut for time, and instead think that it might have been something Scott didn't want in the game. It's literally just an audio file, it could have been added back in at any time, and yet it's no longer present. Let's take a listen.
I am home.
You are home early.
I quit my job.
What about the children? We have a down payment on a new closet.
I do not know what I was thinking. I was compelled to leave my post.
This is no longer working. I am leaving.
Do not go.
May you be happy in the life you have chosen.
If we assume that the dad and the mom bots are William and Mrs. Afton, then this means that William quit his job. Why did he do this? When did he do this? We don't know. Is this before or after Cece got his head chomped? Is it supposed to be after because his head's missing at the table, or before because he's at the table and his head missing just indicates that that is Cece? He can't have quit his Fredbear's job before the chomp because we know that he's employed there right before it happens. Is this maybe sometime earlier in 1983? William also says, I do not know what I was thinking. I was compelled to leave my post. Typically, if you're compelled to leave a job, that means that you're going to get fired, but the company is graciously letting you save face by quitting. But I don't think that that's what this means. He says he doesn't know what he was thinking. So I think it means that he felt compelled to leave. Like he was inspired to leave. Something beyond reason made him want to leave. In this narrative about brainwashing and where the security bots are literally robots controlled by an AI, there's also the possibility that this is actually referring to the perspective of the Staffbots. He was compelled to leave the stage upstairs where he's supposed to be giving a magic show by the AI because the AI decided it's time for him to be William. The mom bot then says,
What about the children? We have a down payment on a new closet.
Typically, this would be a down payment on a new house, maybe the house in Midnight Motorist, but closet is interesting because it calls back to the Silver Eyes trilogy, where robots sit in closets until they're ready to be brought to life. This is a clear connection, but also a murky one, as it doesn't really make sense. Mombot then says, This is no longer working. I am leaving. I am taking the children. Or at least, that's what the captions on the cutting room floor say. All videos I could find of this don't include the line, I'm taking the children. Very weird. I think it makes sense why people would line this up with the tape from earlier with Vanessa, but I think the key difference is that this doesn't indicate that William was abusive or manipulative. It's literally him quitting his job and his wife leaving because of his impulsiveness. If this is the Afton family, I would interpret this as William leaving some sort of stable job upon seeing the flyer for Fredbear's, because he wants to work in the theme restaurant line of work. Like, imagine William is a lawyer, but he really wants to make robots. So he quits his job after seeing a flyer about an animatronic restaurant opening up because he wants to follow his dreams. And then his wife leaves him because he's too impulsive. That's what I get out of this scene. She leaves him in 1983 before Cece dies. Obviously, this is kind of the fan fiction speculation that I'm almost rallying against in this video. But this is the most Mrs. Afton representation to ever Mrs. Afton. This is the most direct reference in the series. And if this is Mrs. Afton, then Ballora certainly is not Mrs. Afton. Where in this representation of the family is William being behind his walls, and music being in her halls, and his empty room? If this is before anybody dies, then what's the no more joy? What's the empty tomb? If Clara is Mrs. Afton, then where in this depiction is William saying that one of the children isn't his and not paying child support? If this is Mrs. Afton, then why would she commit suicide? If this is Mrs. Afton divorcing well before Cece's death in 1983, then how is she watching TV when Mike is running away to check on his brother's body in Midnight Motorist? If this is Mrs. Afton, and I think it is, then all the other Mrs. Aftons aren't Mrs. Afton. Of all of these potential depictions of her in the series, I think this is the most straightforward. And if this is actually her, then none of those other theories hold water. Then again, this was cut. Maybe Scott didn't want it because he didn't write it and it went against his vision. We don't know. But my theory is that Mrs. Afton divorced William before any deaths, for a normal reason, and that Clara, Ballora, Grey Couch Guy, and the Vanessa tapes are not Mrs. Afton lore. Mrs. Afton is, literally, the dining room in the FNAF 4 house. We know it exists, but she doesn't matter. Thank you for watching this ramble. Please be nice to each other in the comments, consider supporting the creators you admire, and never lose sight of the things that are important to you. I would like to thank my patrons, Rosebud, Sophie, and Thamagata, as well as Am Hidden, Klaus, Haley, Jinx, Jose M, Jose R, Just That Spark, Lauren, and Tanner McCoolman, as well as Blue Coon and Genie. And if you want your name on the next big video I put out, a link to my Patreon is in the description. Even a small donation really helps out the channel because it lets me make bigger videos like this without worrying about finances. In the near future, I'm going to release a non-FNAF video, and I would really appreciate you guys giving it a watch so that the algorithm lets me branch out to other horror topics. I'll be back with that video in the near future, and remember, Freddy's stands for Friendly, Respectful Engagement, Discussion, and Discourse Yields Success. Finally figured out that whole acronym so much better now. Oh my god, yes. Thank you for watching.